Hey everybody, it's me, Buster Green here, and every once in a while I like to dig into these rejected cartoon pilots and pitch bibles and see what's in there, because usually there's always a good reason why these shows didn't get picked up, why they got rejected, and sometimes the reason is wild, sometimes they got rejected for being too woke, or maybe too unwoke. But sometimes they're just plain sick and twisted, and today it's the 10th anniversary of Star vs. the Forces of Evil, and for that anniversary, in a fascinating twist, the unutilized Nickelodeon pilot for the show was finally released to the public. And this has been a great discussion this week. Everyone in the animation community is having a pretty interesting discussion about what is this thing and how it's kind of like a case study in general for what happens when a pilot doesn't get picked up, and the weird way that the animation industry has shifted over the past 20 years or so. So let's dig into this thing today. Now, first things first, upon news of this pilot's existence, a large number of people just had this pretty similar take of, oh fuck, Nickelodeon, those goddamn idiots. Did they not understand the gold they gave up on? The shining diamond they threw away into the trash? We got this guy here tweeting out that those MFs really passed on both Star and Adventure Time. The scandal. But okay, everyone calm down, everyone take a chill pill, because what Nickelodeon actually gave up was not the fully realized shows that we all came to grow and love. So let's dig into this pilot. This version is called Star and the Forces of Evil, so that's different. This pilot is really not well developed. The pilot is only a minute long, and there's barely any content to it. All it really consists of is Star at her school acting like a crazy person, other kids immediately not liking her because she's a crazy person. Then she sees a giant caterpillar man who talks like Boris Karloff. He is of course named Boris, and it seems like he's going to enact vengeance, violence against the other kids because he wants to help out Star. I guess it seems like he's going to murder them to please her. Kind of creepy, but then randomly he doesn't, and he just plays a trumpet and it's all good. She's dancing by the end. Minutes up, no more content. So that's it. On its own, this pilot barely even makes sense. It's a massive head scratcher, and if I had seen this in 2009, like in a vacuum, it's definitely not worth talking about. It's not anything good, and I definitely wouldn't greenlight a show over it because it's not impressive and it's not long enough to tell a concise or interesting story about who Star Butterfly is, what the show actually is, or what the fuck is even going on, because it just jumps from one normal thing to one crazy thing and then ends on a non sequitur joke. So let's try to depack all this and explain what this is. Star vs. the Forces of Evil was a show that aired in 2015 on the Disney Channel, and in between the show coming out on Disney in 2015 and this pilot in 2009, 6 years passed, and a lot happened in those 6 years past. I want to say the biggest landmark changes that happened in between those 6 years were that Adventure Time and Steven Universe landed big on Cartoon Network and succeeded in telling more linear, long-arcing stories, and that was the first time that Western cartoons really did that, like, successfully ever. And ultimately, the Star we ultimately got on Disney Channel was a much more complicated show building off of that, with half-hour runtimes and long, complicated season-long stories about magical worlds and mostly relationships, which is kind of cringe. But what's crazy about that, looking back on this original Nickelodeon Star pilot, is it's way more immature than the show we finally got. And yet somehow it's more darker and twisted. And I'd say tonally the pilot is like all over the place. It's kind of trying to hit like a sweet spot between like the Fairly Odd Parents and Hey Arnold, with like some of the other shortly lived Nickelodeon shows around the same time. Like Nickelodeon made a bunch of shows that were 10 minutes long and mostly about like kids going to school and everyday life, while mixing that everyday life with like some wacky chaos and the veneer of like magic. So yeah, beyond all that, that still begs the question, why exactly did this 2009 Star pilot get not picked up? And the answer basically reveals itself when you finally get into the show's pitch bible. Now, as usual, I'm not going to share the pitch bibles with you guys because that's technically studio confidential material. You got to seek it out on your own if you want it that badly. Maybe it's less confidential in this case because I have to assume this one is owned by Nickelodeon, but then it's for a show that Disney ultimately made. So I'm not sure whose lawyers I'd be pissing off the Nick lawyers or the Disney lawyers, but someone's definitely suppressing this pitch Bible, and there's definitely some cease and desist orders around it, so I'm not going to risk it. But hey, at least we're blessed that the pilot's been leaked, so I can show you guys the pilot, because most of the stuff in the Bible anyway is just basically the key art for the pilot, so you're going to see the same thing either way, so no big loss. The pitch Bible is mostly an art book anyway, mostly just filled with Darren Nefsky's original art for Star Butterfly and the show. It's like color palettes and color tests and whatever. The overall art is pretty cool. It definitely has like a fairy tale storybook style. There's also an introduction sub-passage here that says Darren was inspired by the work of Junko Mizuno, who has like a creepy, cute style. By the way, this is my first time really checking out the work of Junko Mizuno, and wow, Darren really sampled this a lot now that I look at it. Anyway, so then getting into it, the Bible starts off with this explanation and pitch of what the show for Nickelodeon actually was. Star vs. the Forces of Evil is about a 5th grade girl named Star Butterfly who believes she is a magical girl superhero. A superhero somewhere between Sailor Moon and Rainbow Bright. She has an elaborate home planet filled with good and bad monsters that she really believes in. These characters interact with her, but no one else can see them. She doesn't actually have any magical powers, and the fantasy world for the most part doesn't exist. Although I want to leave it a little bit open to the viewer. In reality, she's a hyperactive girl who always wears a magical girl costume and carries around a wand, and the other kids at school think she's a weirdo and a freak and she doesn't have a lot of friends. Despite all this, she is committed to saving the day and making her world a better place, and she really cares about the other people and wants to help them, whether or not they want to be helped. So boiling it down, this is not the show we ultimately got. This is a show which was, a show about a magical girl and her dating life. This, on the other hand, is a show about an annoying, crazy girl, potentially with an undiagnosed mental illness, who is constantly hallucinating unreal magical threats to herself and society, and acting out her reaction to them on normal, unsuspecting people with spastic and hilarious violence. Possibly getting those people into dangerous situations because she can't ever clearly draw a line between fantasy and reality, being a threat to herself and others because she just can't ever be serious. There's another page here that has an example describing Star spinning around and spraying people with a water bottle and calling that a magical attack, and describing that at first it would be shown as like a cool magical anime thing, but then reality would sink in and show that she was just a person who threw a water bottle at a bunch of people and upset them. Now, yeah, sure, that's kind of funny, but I don't see how they plan to stretch this into like a 100-episode series. I don't see how they plan to tell that joke more than a couple of times without it becoming stale and old quickly, because in this pitch, Star is just an out-of-touch child constantly hallucinating and annoying everybody. Like, I gotta say, like, this is a terrible idea for a Star vs. the Forces of Evil cartoon, but it's at least a hilarious and kind of based idea for the inevitable Netflix original grim, gritty Star vs. the Forces of Evil psychological horror adult drama reboot that will surely exist at some point in the future because we live in a broken society where everything just gets recycled eventually for nostalgia content. But yeah, that's basically why this pilot idea kind of sucks and why it got rejected by Nickelodeon, because it's basically about mental illness. It's about a mentally ill child alienating herself and annoying everybody because she lives in a fantasy world. On top of it, the show has this kind of like weird Tim Burton drab gothic art style, contrasting with Star's bright and colorful one. And yeah, overall, this is kind of a dark show. I'm actually surprised that this is so much darker than the Disney show we got. The Disney show would occasionally go to like a dark, icky place, but this straight up seems like it's like a weird psychological horror show. So yeah, then here's some additional information about like the real world that she lives in. The world that Star is attempting to be a superhero in is not an easy one. She lives in an apartment with her mom in a rundown neighborhood a block away from her mother's antique store. Her grade school is pretty rundown as well. It has a lot of kids ranging from kindergarten to 6th graders. Her school has its fair share of ugly bullies, mean girls, and fed-up teachers. Despite all this, Star loves running around her neighborhood, looking for adventures and people who need help. She contrasts with her dark surroundings. So yeah, despite the fact that this seemingly looks like it's set in like a Tim Burton-esque rundown neighborhood in Chicago, the Bible then clarifies on the next page in the pitch, Star actually lives in the Los Feliz neighborhood of North Hollywood. I used to live a few towns over from there. I used to pass Los Feliz on my commute. Don't get me wrong, it's not the best part of LA, but it's still Hollywood. It's still, $1 million houses. It's a pretty decent section of town. I mean, sure, there's crime, but they have a Trader Joe's, and I could never afford to shop there. Did the final show also take place in Los Feliz? If it did, it felt like a much happier and more realistic depiction of Los Feliz. Then there's the next page here that seemingly implies that Star has potentially the ability to drag people into her hallucination world. And then there's another page here just describing the hallucination world as Star's home planet filled with strange and interesting creatures. Most of them can talk and interact with Star, but are a bit wild. Although this world is on another planet, it is not the space age. It is a fantasy world with bizarre dragons, bizarre is spelled wrong, unicorns, castles, and princesses scattered about. There's actually a lot of typos in this now that I'm looking for them. Okay, there's one last thing worth mentioning in this one. It's that the supporting characters are just the rest of the kids that Star goes to school with. And they're completely different kids from like what we got in the final show. So there's like not Marco or Jackie or anyone. The overall school lineup is just a bunch of generic characters that pretty much look like the Hey Arnold cast. A majority of the characters here aren't really fleshed out or described, with the exception of these two girls, Jenna and Mallory, who appear in the pilot. Jenna and Mallory are Star's former best friends from kindergarten, and they are not cool or popular, so they're constantly bitter and angry about their lives. Back in kindergarten, Star was friends with them, but she went all magic now and they can't stand her anymore, and they wish she would leave them alone. They both like horses and gossiping, and Mallory is the leader. Now, once again, interesting key phrase there to read into is that the implication here is that Star was normal in kindergarten and she used to have a lot of friends, but as she got older, she became crazier and lost all these friends, which once again leads to another question of, okay, so Star used to be normal, but eventually developed this psychotic magical girl persona, which then brings us to this like Joker 2-esque trial of Star Butterfly, where you have to ask, was it all an act, or is she actually insane in this version? And yeah, that's a really weird one to like dig into, because I can definitely see why the studio ultimately rejected this. At a certain point, it implies that this is a dark and twisted story about mental illness, and I start to think, well, yeah, and when you put it like that, maybe old Nefsky was onto something here, but it's definitely a terrible idea for Nickelodeon and a show for kids made in 2009. But you know what? After reading this whole thing start to finish, I kind of think I would be down to check out this version of Star vs. the Forces of Evil if it ever got made at some point in the future. That being said, back to real life and real history, this version failed, and the animation industry evolved a lot between 2009 and 2015. A year after this, in 2010, Adventure Time debuted on Cartoon Network, and over its first 3 seasons, it evolved from a kids' gag comedy show into a darker, more lore-heavy show that I think really pushed the envelope for storytelling in kids' animation. And then that was followed up by Steven Universe, which came out of the doors swinging in 2013 as kind of a psychological and lore-heavy show, but with some catchy musical numbers. And then seemingly taking lessons from both of those shows, Disney put together this final version of Star vs. the Forces of Evil that came out in 2015, and it had a mostly successful 4-season run until it ended on a complicated ending that was pretty controversial, and that's a kid's show, so I'm not going to talk about it today, but leave a comment if you want me to discuss it, but I feel like it's outside my wheelhouse. Beyond that, Darren Nefsky has kind of apparently been very sick lately and not working a lot, but she has stated that she either wants to make a Star vs. Forces of Evil film remake or a sequel, but so far nothing has come of it, except for some of the Star characters eventually getting cameos in the recent Disney Chibiverse crossover show. Now, I wish Darren Nefsky a swift recovery, and I hope that if she ever does get that Star vs. the Forces of Evil movie made, maybe it will be a dark, gritty, and twisted cerebral take like this original rejected pilot. I think a lot of people wouldn't be expecting that, and I think it would really shock and surprise some people. But hey, what do you guys think? You're the public, you're the audience. Was this original Nickelodeon version too dark, too weird, too much like Hey Arnold, too belittling of mental illness, or do you think it actually has some potential? Would you have preferred this to the Disney version we eventually got? I do think the Disney version was developed more, but I do enjoy that this is a weird and more twisted take on the character. Either way, it's so different from the show we actually got that I do think it almost stands on its own as a really fascinating alternate concept of what this character could have been. And that's everything for me. I'm out here, but yeah, leave a comment if you enjoyed this one, and leave a comment if you want me to dig into like any more of these old pitch Bibles, because I think they're pretty fun stories overall. All right, I'm out. Subscribe. Good night. Peace.